Hey guys, today we're looking at my 1984 Honda Shadow VT500 Bobber build, and we're just going to look at some of the mods that I've done today to get it looking the way that it is. So without further ado, we'll get into it right now. We're going to start with what everybody wants to see on a Bobber build, which would be the rear end and the exhaust. So lowering this bike, first thing I did was lower it, and what you're going to notice when you look at these shocks is that they're about 14 inches total length. I believe it's 13 inches eyelet to eyelet, which is the top and the bottom, and that would be the stock measurements. I went down 1.5 inches, less than that. It's a good ride height, but you're going to need to change some other things in order to do that. These shocks right now are not the first set that I put on. This is the second set. You want to look for a set that has holes, not like a fork mount. There's different kinds of shocks you'll see when you start looking, and I had to narrow these mounts down. There's very few shocks that you're going to find that are just going to pop right on. I have had one set that I'll throw up at the end that they just plugged right in, no problem, but this set I had to bore out the eyelet size and then also reduce the mount size so that they'd fit on. Down here, if I remember correctly, it being only one side, it could have been both sides, but it was blocked by the exhaust. The stock exhaust comes out on both sides, and I could not remove that bolt completely without pulling the exhaust. Now, I really like the exhaust on this bike because the way that it comes out side by side, right on the right side of the bike. And as I said, with the stock setup, it comes out one pipe on either side. So what happens with the stock setup, these two pipes here come out and then they go into a power chamber that sits parallel, or perpendicular rather, to the exhaust. It goes this way. And then that splits the exhaust pipes on either side of the wheel. With a little bit of work, some WD-40 and some hammers and maybe a little bit of Sawzall, you can remove the power chamber right there. I was able to get mine to slide off after removing the bolts, but it was super rusted. It took a little bit, but I got there. And once that's off, I just got some Amazon tips, measured the diameter, and they slid right on. I put some baffles in too, but they didn't really do a whole lot, so I ended up taking them out. Now, as for the seat and the tail light, most of that job is just removing things. As for the rest of the Bobber build, that's going to be most of your job, is just removing things. The seat was kind of a pain in the ass. There's only really one mounting bolt, which is going to be right there. That also is responsible for mounting the tank. So I wanted to incorporate that through my solo seat, and it's kind of a ghetto way to set it up, but I just have the plate. I've modified the plate so that it's just the plate itself, and it's been cut there so that it's flat. I've bent the tips down here so that it just kind of hugs the frame a little bit, and then, like I said, it's ghetto. It's just zip tied with some holes drilled through it there to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere, because I've almost lost this before. The seat arm that the seat is mounted onto, you're not going to be able to see it, but normally this seat is mounted on an arm and it's able to swivel up and down. I've cut that arm as well, again, so that that's just flat. So the seat is bolted to the arm is cut flat so that it can sit flat on the plate, and then the plate is cut flat so that it can sit on the tank mount. So it's just the plate, the arm, those two are mounted, and then the seat nice and tight. I forget what I was going to say next. Now, of course, for the Bobber, you need to have the chopped rear end. If you look real closely on mine, it's not too pretty. From a distance, it looks all right. I've gone through a few different taillight setups on this, but I think this is the one I'm going to stick with. Let's get up a little closer here. We'll just see that the frame is just cut and the loop is just stuck in there. All I had to do with the loop is just bend it a little bit wider, cut it down to length. At some point I will clean that up, weld it in there, and it'll look nicely, but today it's just got some screws that I put in there, and then I just twisted the heads off so that they turned into rivets. If I ever need to take it out, I'll just drill it off. Tail light there. And that leaves a nice exposed rear tire. Now, as for the air intake, I have a separate video on that. It turned out really nicely, and it complements the build pretty well. It's just the same thing as a short air intake on a Honda Civic, exactly like I said at the start of the video. Now we have the plate mount. If we look down here, it's just mounted to the axle bolt. Up here we're going to see a lot of custom stuff, some stock stuff mixed in with it. Handlebars were a big job, I'm not going to lie to you. Now, I've kept the stock cables, which would be choke cables, throttle cable, clutch, all that is stock. That being said, it was not easy to keep the stock stuff because the length is pretty important, and having to route the cables in a way where they'd still work and not bind up, it was pretty difficult. It probably took me 8 tries, and that involves taking the headlight off, taking the dash all off, just to get the cables all the way through that you want. I did it, but we're going to cover that when I step around to the front end and how I did that. I also had to shorten a lot of the harnesses. That was more of a personal preference, just because I don't like wires dangling everywhere, but the wires that go to the power switches and all the indicator switches, everything like that, shortened those all up, and then the dash lights and the gauge, everything like that was just a couple inches too long, and it was all bundling up right in the head, so I took care of all that. So the handlebars that I chose, just a sportier set of handlebars. Up close, it's just, there's really not much to look at other than the new grips and the drop down mirrors. The mirrors are actually upside down. Like if you look real close, you'll see that the writing on the top, that's upside down. They bang into the tank, you know, they're annoying. I have to drop my knee real wide to turn, but I love the way they look and I'm not changing them. So I really like how the dash turned out. I chose to go with just a solo tack instead of the speedometer. At some point I want to go with an all-in-one, but the way that it is right now, the mount is stock and the gauge is stock, but the mount is modified. So it was a pretty clever way to get it customized and looking cool without having to really put any money into it. I can't remember if it's a larger bracket or a smaller bracket, but this one right here that clamps into what I would call the head, the main clamp that clamps onto the bars. And then onto that clamp, there's another one that clamps and holds the gauges. The stock setup is pretty beefy, lots of plastic and everything. So I took all of that off, took the gauges out, took both of these brackets off, and then I looked at them real good. I have some photos that I'm going to throw up to show you what I modified and how I cut them. But essentially what I've done here is this bracket, originally it should be on the bottom of this, and it should be facing the same way but upside down. So I've taken the original bracket, I've flipped it and put it on top, and then the bracket that that holds the gauges on, I've cut that and I've just put that through the original bracket. But it's just essentially a little switcheroo and a cut here and there, and that's all there is to it. So from the front end, it looks a little bit different. First thing I'm going to say is you can lower where the clamps are on your forks, and that's just going to stance your bike a little bit differently, lean the front down a little bit harder, and that's might make your build look a little bit cooler, especially if you've lowered the back end. That might be something important to do. The headlight mount is no longer the stock one. The original just wasn't adequate for this. It was too bulky, and mine was actually broken. I think the original mount goes up here. So I'll show you, yeah, mine broke right there. So I didn't want to use that anymore. I had an aftermarket LED headlight. It was actually pretty cool. It was plug and play. Easy peasy putting it on. I did have to cut the back of the housing to, I think, run this this tack cable down through it because it just sat way too closely. So I had to cut the housing so that this had a straight path. I decided to go back to the stock headlight. I kept the main bracket like I said, but if you look real closely, these brackets are stock. They were on the stock headlight. And again, this is the same situation as the tack mount. I've just modified the main bracket and flipped it. I believe originally the bracket came out like this. So now I've flipped it on the inside and I've bent it a little bit harder. I cut the edges and I bent it at a harder angle. So what that has accomplished is it's just given me more clearance in behind the headlight to run all those cables and all that nasty stuff. So from the front on, you can't see shit really. It's not going to bother you. And from riding position, can't see any of that. So it's pretty good. And like I said, lots of clearance in there to run any cables and wires that you have. Now this is where I ran into a lot of issues running the cables for the handlebars, but having that extra clearance for the headlight was important. Having them bow out kind of like this and then running them down in between, you really want to make sure that they're not rubbing anywhere too much, and you want to make sure that they have lots of clearance when they turn. It can be a real safety issue if your throttle cables bind, or even if your choke cables bind when you turn really sharply or something like that. You can stick your throttle wide open, and it has happened to me. It's dangerous. The headlight is also lowered a little bit, and I tucked the fuse box and the horn up underneath the headlight. Originally they were down below, mounted down here. I've taken the bracket, flipped it upside down and bent it forward a little bit, and then I just put the bolts in from the top still. I think they're threaded on the bracket. So once again, flip and tuck and everything's out of the way. I can't remember if I had to shorten any of the harnesses to do that, but it achieved the effect because from the front end, I'll throw up a side-by-side photo, but it doesn't look anything like stock used to. And engine block's painted, a lot of stuff is painted, but the engine block in particular, you want to use high heat paint, bake that on so that when it gets hot it doesn't fall off on you. It's kind of a process, but it's worth it if it complements the rest of the build. Things like the forks, you want to powder coat. The clutch and the brake levers, you want to powder coat those because they're going to take a lot of impacts and you don't want the paint chipping. Tank I just painted. It needs to be done regularly, but I like doing that, so that's okay. And yeah, I mean, it's just been a couple of years taking a piece or two off here and there, painting it, putting it back on, seeing what I like to change, and it's turned out pretty nicely. So let me know what you guys think, and I hope you enjoyed my rambling today. Take care.